to Universal Truths with Mark Fults, coming to you from WBHM-DB in beautiful downtown Birmingham, Alabama, and talking to you from my cute little haunted store in Milton, Florida, at the Pea Ridge Flea Market. And I'm talking to you tonight. This is the first time I've been able to film this in my store, and I love it at night with all the lights turned on and in its colorful chakra color candy coating. So now I have been away for a couple of weeks. I had to go on a trip. We have technical difficulties here and there because we had a lot of stuff going on. So tonight, I thought I would go back to my roots and do ghost stories of a specific kind. I'm actually going to be talking to you about Abraham Lincoln's ghost. And then when I was researching some of that, refreshing my mind because I'm old, I found a few other things around Washington, in the building, the White House, all of that. So we're going to cover that as well. So I'll have a few stories from around DC, a few stories from Georgetown, and the majority of it tonight we'll be talking about Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln and their children and the traumas that led to the hauntings. And he was the first president and first lady who brought spiritualism into the White House, which meant seances. And he was interested in that somewhat, and Mary really became embedded in that way, way, way before they went to the White House. But then she really became enmeshed in it after their children started dying. And then, of course, after Abraham himself was assassinated. So we'll talk about those ghost stories, and then there are other ghost stories that I barely remembered, and then there were some I found that some new aspects I found that were new. So maybe they'll be new to you as well. So tonight, anyone who's just seeing me for the first time, Universal Truths, we do ghost stories. I'm a psychic. I own a little store called Gypsy Moon in Milton, Florida. Ta-da! And I've been working in metaphysics since I was 18. I'm now 62. I was murdered in a random act of violence 32 years ago. Did my near death experience, came back from that, and that helped my talents. And it also, I don't know, it sparked my imagination because all the things that I saw in the near death experience and in all the things I've experienced with people coming to me to get readings or with their wanting to talk to their dead ones, their deceased loved ones. And I've had people come to me that are go from, Baptist up to Buddhist, almost all across the board. And I have a friend who has been a Buddhist before, so that's why I say Buddhist. Um, but I've covered a lot of territory in my life. And so, anyone that's just tuning in, we do stories and talk about metaphysical issues, spiritual issues, the Anunnaki, ghost, which are my favorite, and just anything that is current. There's a lot of metaphysical things that are current going on that I try to cover, and things I will be hitting on very soon are the new cults to watch out for that are kind of trying to use metaphysics as the entry drug. And so it's nothing new in a way. It sounds new and all that stuff. But that is when I was being raised in the 60s, there was in the 60s and 70s, there were tons of cults that moved in because people were looking for something new. And uh, it just, I'm sorry, I see something weird here that I hadn't seen before. But the cults ushered in with the hippie movement and people living in communes, and that's where the Charlie Manson thing happened because the hippies were kind of doing the commune idea, and then it just evolved and evolved and evolved around different things that people were searching. So now people are searching again, and the problem is there's a lot out there that's searching for you as well. So we will be talking those, but not tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about ghost stories and um, some interesting ones that caught my imagination when I was young, back in the covered wagon days. Before internet and um, before TV became what it became. We used to have three channels with a rabbit ear on top. And you were lucky if you got the three channels. And so in my day, we read a lot, and I love to read. I love to do that, and um, actually, I miss researching and doing things the way it was, and so I do it now. And now that I write books, I do my most of my books are from my own consciousness. So, but then there are things that you have to look at, that are when you're researching historical stories or you're researching something that happened that, you want to look into it a little further. So, I still like to dig. And now here's the wonderful thing about internet. you know, you just type it in and you can find it. You don't have to go to a library. You don't have to look for special books, places that you have to send off for catalogs and wait for weeks. It's pretty instantaneous. Some of it is, some of the internet stuff I find is a great help, and then some of it is a great hindrance. So you have to take it all with a grain of salt. But it is a great, wonderful. I love to get on and just research, but I still research in the old way that I would. I find something, I do as much looking as I can, and and then if it's something like a ghost story, sometimes my own ghost stories come from my own experience, and I'm finding my friend Teal Gray tells me, she's really shocked how I magnetize things to me and things will just fall out. And I'm doing a cookbook. I mean, grandma's good old cookbook. And it has been like being in a leaky boat, because the more you look, the more the water comes in. So, because it's like, I collect antique recipes. I collected my grandmother's and my family's, and mine, and then I started collecting antique recipes. And so, now they just come to me in gobs, and in gobstoppers. Um, I've collected hundreds and hundreds over the years, but now you got, you know, um, so much more to look at, because I'll find these things. It's like, what is that? What is Solaritus? What is this? Which is like a baking powder, or, you'll find all this weird stuff. So, I have fun. So if you're here to have fun, let's have fun. Now, the story I will start with, I'm going to tell one before I start the Lincoln stories because I found this story in particular uh, curious. I remember this from the 70s, is when I heard it. And it's called the Gaslight Spectre. Now, what was the Gaslight Spectre? Now, the Gaslight Spectre was in Georgetown. Most of the stories that was scraping around like for this, from DC and Georgetown, and um, they're in Georgetown. This came from an article like in 1935, and it was a minister of a spiritualist church. And the reason we're going to be talking spiritualism a little bit is because of Mary Todd Lincoln. So there was a minister of a spiritualist church in Georgetown, and the reporter he was talking to, they didn't give the man's name, but he had this fascinating story when he was a little boy. So this was 1935. So when he was a little boy, in the 1890s, um, he and his family, which he had a fairly large family, and this is before electricity became very common, and everyone had gas, or you used candle, or you used oil lamps. Now, to show you how slow a process it was to get electricity, my mother, who just passed in 2019, back in the 30s, they were still using oil lamps and candles, and they had outhouses. They didn't have indoor plumbing. And that was in the 30s, early 40s. And I know someone else who they didn't have indoor plumbing. If you wanted to take a bath, you went out to the creek out in the back. You did not. Or you brought in pails of water. You had running water. You ran for it. You ran with it. But you filled up the tub with hot water and took your bath. And then if there were a lot of people, then, before you'd have 10 people taking baths in the same water sometimes. So, it wasn't until later, unless you were fairly rich, that you would have running water, have electricity. So mostly everybody had gas or candle and oil lamps. So this family had gas and fireplaces. And when electricity came in, people would have lights that would be like half and half. You'd have gas in it where you could use it, or you could turn a switch and use the electricity because people were scared of electricity. My favorite story, a friend of mine, Robert Bruce Falls, used to tell me, or told me years ago. There was a little farmer lived in the country, and when electricity came in, he had each room had a little cloth covered cord with a socket. So you would put a bulb in the socket. And so he only had one bulb. He didn't believe in electricity. So, but he had one bulb. He didn't believe in having it in every room. And he thought he would take the bulb from room to room, so wherever he needed it. And when he would take it out of one room, he would take a corn cob and put it in the socket. And that's because he thought the electricity would run out like water. So he would plug it up with a corn cob. And that's how much people understood electricity. So this is pre any of that. So this young man, when he was young, he and his, I'm looking at a flying wasp or something, uh, the family was sitting out on the porch enjoying a lovely evening, talking, laughing, having a good time. And they were, renting this, at that time, be an old Victorian home. So at some point, the father, when it was starting to get dark, he went, gathered himself up, and was going to go start a fire in the fireplace because he knew they would need it. It was going to be chilly that night. So he got up, went in, struck his match to light the gas light. And when he turned the light on, they heard him scream. So the family runs in, and they couldn't comprehend what they were looking at. They were all stunned. On this very old, overstuffed Victorian couch was laying this beautiful young woman with long hair, and the long hair was draped over the curved arm of the sofa. And she was obviously dead. And the father said, "Now watch this." Because there was like a key on these gas sockets, the gas jets coming out of the wall. So when he would turn it down, she would get more visible. If he turned it up, she would start to disappear. And the more that he turned it down, the more she seemed to glow. And so they did this over and over, and the more he would turn it up, she would disappear. The darker it would get, the more visible she was. And then they began to smell an excessive amount of gas. So the father chased everybody out, made sure the gas lines were not uh, going to, there wasn't a gas leak. And he found out there wasn't. And there's what's been here. And he made it safe for them. And eventually, she disappeared. So that night they all went to bed, but nobody could sleep. They got up the next morning and they were just all trying to figure it out. It amazed them so much. So they were renting the house. They didn't know what had happened there. So they went to the neighbors, and the neighbors who had been there for a while said that after the Civil War, there had been a beautiful girl living there, a young girl. She was in love with a Civil War soldier, Civil War, and he got killed in battle. And she just couldn't stand living, so she decided to kill herself. So she dramatically laid herself out beautifully on the couch, blew out the pilot lights, and turned the gas on, and died from gas inhalation. So after that, this man, when he grew up to be a man, this boy was fascinated because they had seen to them, proof that there was life after death. So he became a spiritualist. And as a matter of fact, he became the minister of a spiritualist church. And the reporter said that in the church itself, other people they talked to, because this was 1935, and then um, the reporter who was reporting on that, the person, it was in the 60s. So people who were in the church would talk about, in the spiritualist church, because, they were so open to the spirits that books would move on their own, and in his office, and chairs would, you could hear the chairs being moved on their own, scraped across the floor, and all sorts of metaphysical things. But that's what a spiritualist is used to. I have spiritualism roots. I have a great grandmother or great great grandmother who was a spiritualist and made her living doing that. The things that spiritualists do, talking to spirits, and I didn't find that out until a few years ago. So it was a huge movement that began with the Fox sisters in the 1840s, I think, and it almost overtook most of like the Baptists and Methodist kind of thing. It became a church of its own. Uh, the Fox sisters started it. The little girls in in a house that there was this knocking on the walls, and so they started playing games back with it, and it began kind of like talking to them in code, and they called him Mr. Splitfoot. But later on, they found out it was a peddler who had been murdered and in the house. And but the girls became very famous for the rappings and the levitations and all the stuff that started in the metaphysical aspect. And so it took off, and it became huge from the 1840s on. And Mary Todd Lincoln was an early believer. And when I was little, I didn't know very much about spiritualism, but it would have been my kind of thing because I was into that. I was raised in the days of dark shadows, and I got to see seances every day, or weekly, or they were talking to ghosts, they were time traveling, there were witches, there were vampires, there were other beings just beyond the veil. So, and coming up in the 60s with that kind of stuff going on, I was, that was a fit for me. But um, spiritualism kind of died out early in this last century. Like by the 20s, 30s, it had hit its peak. The other churches who were scared of it taking away business, or whatever, they um I mean, in Chattanooga there was a huge one. There was a huge um park with a stone bridge, and the park is still there. You can go see it. But there was a spiritualist group bought at a church, and they would have seances with thousands of people on this beautiful natural bridge, and people would come from all over the country to see it by horse and buggy and walking, just you know however they could get there. And they were chased off by the local churches. They came up and burned crosses in their yards, and threatened death, and made them sell their property because it was a threat. And so, and in the 20s, Henry Houdini um, went to quite a few psychics and didn't get what he wanted, and he thought it was all fake. So then he went on a tirade to destroy psychics, and there are stories that, there were some people who really had talent, uh, but he destroyed them. He would plant evidence and do that, allegedly, to do it. But I see why. It was a threat to a lot of people. But as a psychic, I see things all the time. There are things I have that I can, I have the written proof. I have people who've written what's happened. I have evidence of what I can do and other people can do. I mean, so it's part of human nature. It's part of human experience, which is older than religion and it's older than science. Science is a baby. It's only a couple hundred years old. Human experience goes back thousands and thousands of years, millions maybe, you know, unless, of course, you believe the Earth is 6,000 years old. Then, if you're one of those people who believe that, then, then it's 6,000 years old. But whatever the experience is, that's how far it goes back. And so spiritualism was kind of like that. It was a return to our spiritual roots and the excitement of talking to spirit and the other world and knowing that the other world was just uh, not even an inch away from us, really. And in that world of spiritualism, it became huge during the Civil War because you have to remember thousands, million, I really should have looked up how many, but just thousands of people just went off and disappeared because they didn't have dog tags at that time. So they didn't even have an ID to take off the bodies. And where I come from in Chickamauga Battlefield, close to where I live, there's one place where, during the biggest battle, like 34,000 people died within 24 hours, kind of thing, not including horses. And after that battle, the bodies lay there for months because there were thousands of people. So they would dig trenches and just dump these people in there, and it took months to do it. And by the time they got to them, they couldn't identify who they were. They didn't have, like I said, they didn't have a government funded thing to identify them with. So people's sons, husbands, boyfriends, fiancés went into the world to this war and never were heard of again. Got killed, got shot, got blown up. Uh, and nobody knew where they were buried, what happened to them. So spiritualism gave a way to get closure to say, I want to talk to Johnny, I want to talk to Bobby, and they go to these psychics, and the psychics would talk to the spirits and let them know if they needed help or if they were okay or where they were or what happened. And then people began to do it themselves. The spiritualists would, and it was a woman's movement. So the spiritualist movement gave women an income that they could have of their own. Because at that time, if you were working, you could only be a cook or clean for someone or sew. You weren't given real jobs with real income that were beyond those. And those are real jobs. If you've never had to sew, that's a real job. If you've ever had to clean, that's a real job. But I mean, they were designated jobs for women. They wouldn't allow them to do things that were outside of that realm. You were supposed to look pretty or be able to do the feminine arts. That's it. Or have children. Be a wife. You were only successful if you were a wife and had children. And then the women were able to have businesses, basically, open up business and do readings and do table tippings and do seances. And there were groups of people doing this. So that's what Mary Todd started with. And she was a staunch spiritualist. And before they became, Mr. or Mrs. President, they had four children. Lincoln's, let's see, they had Robert, and they had Eddie or Edward. They had Willie and Tad, like Tadpole. And Eddie died early on in their marriage. He was 4 years old. And who knows? I can't remember what they said. But back then, mortality, if you made it to 10 years old, you were just a miracle. And there were so many things going on. And once they were in the White House during the war, Lincoln's really his favorite son. He loved his children. He was very good with children. He loved his children. But he really was fond of Willie. And Willie, when he was 12, while they were in the midst of the Civil War, got TB and died. Now, Lincoln, when he was 4, his mother died. So then his sister, who was 11, took over the household and raised them, took care of adult men. Then when she was 21, she died. And then the first girl that he fell in love with, Anne Rutherford, I think is what her name was, she died of typhoid, I think. And I think that's what his mother died from. And they really didn't know he was crazy about her until after she died. And then he just became so melancholy. And if it rained, he would just get so depressed. He just would go, I, I can't stand that Anne is getting wet, that the water is getting on her. So he was very melancholy, but he had something about him where he attracted people. He had a very hard childhood. His father treated him badly, I think. Um, he would hire him out as like a slave. Now, they went to church that didn't believe in gambling, dancing, or slavery. So that's when he started off not believing in slavery and whatever else they say. He started off with a mother who, and they avoided that. But his father had no problem hiring him out for work, and he considered him lazy, even though he was very tall and very strong. And actually, he was very known. He was huge. He was tall. They think he had Marfans, which I have Marfans. And sometimes Marfans people, they just are very tall. They're very lanky. And he had to cut fences, and he was doing all this stuff, and he was very strong. And he won quite a few wrestling matches against people who were known wrestlers. And he was very athletic, but his father thought he was lazy and would call him lazy because he liked to read and write and do poetry. Now, this is someone who he didn't have it in his life. He had to get that. He didn't get very much of an education because he had to work. And his father would hire him out, which means until he was of age, he could hire him out like a servant and confiscate all that money, not give him any, just make him work, and he saw Abraham as a work hand. But his stepmother was very sweet to him, and she understood, and she fostered that in him, that the reading and all that. And he self-taught himself. But because of his mother dying, his sister dying, and Rutledge dying, he was very sad. And then when he met Mary Todd, they had a kind of a rough marriage. A lot, people wouldn't probably want to hear that, but they were fiery. She was smart. She was politically savvy, and I don't think without her you would have gotten the Lincoln that you got. So she was very important. She was really pushing him, but she was very stubborn. She was very fiery. And when he was getting married, they put it off one time, and then they started again. And someone said he was getting ready to go get married at her sister's house, and somebody said, "Where you going?" And he says, "Probably to hell," you know, because he knew it was going to be hard. But to be a politician, you had to have a wife, and for whatever, and I think seriously, he loved her very much. But boom, boom, boom. But she was a hard as nail woman. But boy, she loved her man, and she would go after those politicians who she felt like were his enemies. She would eat them like crackers, and they hated her. And so, and she was smart. She knew politically. She really was raised politically. And she had had a lot of loss. She had lost her mother at a young age. She had lost a lot. And I think the spiritualism gave her comfort and a way to deal. But when they got to the White House, she didn't get along with most people because she had certain ideas. And the thing you have to remember, women back then, you were supposed to be pretty, arm candy. You were supposed to be a good mother, maybe a good cook, or take care of the house and make sure you have, you know, get that all, but and look good for your husband. And here she was, politically minded, huge, forceful personality, huge, tremendous opinions, and she could only express them with her husband. And he could only allow her so much leeway because he was the president. She couldn't lead the country, you know. But I think she would have. But she would, come and talk to him and tell him what she thought about stuff or what he should do. So there was that input. But when they came into the White House, there were a lot of people very fiercely loyal to him, but the majority weren't that great about her. Because, like I said, she was like fire and water, and I've known people like this. And like I said, they had lost one of their sons, Eddie. Then during the war, once the war was going, I've read several stories over my lifetime about, what started him, and of course, it was about the Union and everything, but he was very anti slavery. And there was a place he visited, the Crenshaw House, and that turned him off of it. He was raised to not believe in slavery, and because they were poor people. And I think people used them as slavery, viewed them as, potential slaves, because, you could be an indentured slave. A lot of people forget, there was other types of slavery. The Indians were put into slavery. There were people from the English, the Irish, that were put into indentured slavery, and they would come and supposed to work off their debts. Well, then there was tricks they could do to extend it where you never got away. And so there were all types of slavery here, just not just African American or black slavery. There was Indians and Irish and English and debtors prison, in England and stuff. They had debtors prisons, and I think and that kind of everywhere kind of had that. So you could be a slave, um, and then there were some slaves who, when they became freed, they owned slaves because it was power, and so there's a lot we don't understand about all of that, but thank God he got rid of that. Because there were people, I think, before presidents who wanted to get rid of it, but they were afraid of what it would do. And see what it did do. I mean, it caused um, like an earthquake, but he did it. No matter what you think of him, no matter what you think of them, no matter what you think of anybody else, he did it. Now, the reason that Lincoln understood loss probably any more than any president at the time, before or since, is during the war he lost his favorite son, and it's where kind of the strangeness of his relationship with death came in, because when Willie died, they didn't have a place to put him because it was the war going on. There wasn't time to go build a monument or a tomb. So one of his congressman friends uh, loaned him a crypt, and Lincoln couldn't let him go. And he just, he would sit with him. He sat with him a long time. They put him in the crypt. He had them open it twice. There's a beautiful little, I've seen a picture years ago of this beautiful little wrought iron chair. And he would go and sit in this wrought iron chair, and he had him open the tomb twice. And he would sit there for hours crying, watching his son. And the only thing that stopped it is, the march of decomposition. So he just couldn't let him go. And it was like with Anne Rutledge, every time it rained, he would just get depressed. And so here he was. And in those days, what was there to treat depression with? Nothing. Alcohol, maybe drugs, but he didn't have all those options. He was having to take care of a country. So he was dealing with this incredible loss, this incredible depression. And if you've never experienced it, let me tell you, as someone who has, when I was young and I went through a traumatic loss, and I was going through a very bad childhood. And I remember when something happened, it just took me, you just fall down the deepest hole there is. There is no hope, no light, no nothing. And some people don't come back from that, like the girl, like the gaslight specter. She couldn't go on. And Lincoln, people would talk about, they could hear him crying and laying in his room and just prostrate with grief. And this was, he just couldn't get past it, but he had to move on. Now, Mary Todd, who had been depressed since Eddie died, since the 4-year-old, now here's their favorite little boy, the light of their life. He's died. She's had a lot of loss, and she knows she's married to a man that, people want to kill her, want to kill her children, want her dead. So she was going through a lot. And nowadays they would probably say that she was manic or bipolar or schiz, maybe. And a lot of times they demonize people, especially women, when they have problems like that. And they'll say, oh, she was a woman, she was weak. No, she was a pretty strong woman. She just started, it kicked in manic depression or bipolar. And she became terribly sad. And during that time, mourning was an art, you know, and people would wear black for, some people wore black for the rest of their lives. So it used to be, it was like, you'd wear black for a year, then you would go to darker shades and then go back to regular clothing. People like Queen Victoria, who never came out of mourning after her husband Albert died. Um, Mary Todd never came out of mourning. And so, and actually, I have a piece of one of her black dresses that I got from the John Latimer collection, which I think I put on a haunted items show I did. But she lived in mourning the rest of her life, and it wasn't over yet because Willie had died. So she became head first. She dove into spiritualism. Now, Lincoln wasn't particularly pro religion of any sort, but he was kind of interested in the spiritualism. But also for her, he knew she was very fragile, so he let her just go into it. It's like, do what you need to do to get through this, because he was having to run the country. And mental health care for your loved ones sometimes was tying them up to the wall, or putting them locking them up in the attic or in the cellar, or just locking them in a room with a slot in the door. Actually, I knew somebody, their grandmother or great grandmother had gone off crazy. So people would keep them at home or put them in institutions. The institutions were horrible, horrifying places. Horrible. You wouldn't want anyone to go in there, not even your worst enemy. So they would keep them at home. So they had this woman, they built a special outhouse for her, that she was in the outhouse. And there was a slot, and they would pass food to her. And they would tell the children, don't put your hands in there, she'll hurt you, you know. And that's how grandma, was. So Lincoln was dealing with the country gone to pot, thousands upon thousands of people dying, and he was feeling the pain of the people who were losing, because he had just lost his son. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew the gravity of it, and it was because of him that these people were out there dying, and he took it seriously, but he took the world on his shoulders. And so he had that going. So Mary Todd became big friends with quite a few psychics, and she would go and to seances and things like that. But of course, she was the president's wife. They didn't want that getting out really there, that was happening as much. So she had seances at the White House, and there were at least two they know of that Lincoln attended. And the first one, he was very impressed, because mediums and psychics of that era, it was full on, let's do physical manifestations. And they would produce, ectoplasm, and there were things that they were doing that there just ain't nobody doing it now. And they would do levitations, table tipping, in levitations, and I've seen that. I've had it happen to me before, sometimes not expectedly. One time I was doing a seance for healing and closure, and it was for a group of Mensa people, which, they don't believe in any of this stuff. And I thought, why are you here, for it? But we were doing it, and I had a successful seance, but it was very difficult. And a friend of mine at the time, Judith, who's now deceased, she was sitting there assisting me. And there was a table in front of us, a coffee table, and everybody had their eyes closed, and I was summoning the spirits to come and talk. And the table started sliding, and it just slid 3 feet away. Now I was watching Judith, and she was trying to put a candle on the table, and she wasn't really watching, and she kept trying to reach it, and it was kept sliding. And I thought it was so funny. But I have seen levitation. I have seen tables move. I've heard the rappings and all that, and I've produced some of that, and I channel. So it's not uncommon. But back then, it was a whole different ballgame. And so Lincoln apparently was very impressed with this levitation and the wrappings, let me see, I can find the name. I want to say the name of the psychic was like Charles Sharp or something. Um, I can't remember. I can't see in my notes. But there was, I'll have to look it up. But there was, it was a psychic that she loved. And anyone out there who finds the name, you tell me, you know, post it and let me know. Um, but and then there was another one reportedly that happened that the psychic levitated a piano, which I've heard people going, the psychics could, the mediums. It's not just psychics; it's a mediumship, and it's a whole different ballgame. And I knew somebody whose grandmother, they said she would levitate the table. She could point at a chair and go and point, and it would slide to where she wanted it. So, and that's part of electromagnetic fields. So, learning, they had something they were doing that was a little different, that was using their electromagnetic fields to affect the electromagnetic fields of the items. So, this piano was levitating, so he had a senator sit on it, and it didn't affect it at all. And it would go up and down according to what the um, psychic was telling it. So he was exposed to seances, and there were seances in the White House. So, which I thought was fascinating. When I was a little boy, I think that was just cool. So, we go further, and the war ends, and he's running for election again. And um, there's a lot of things also going on with him stress wise, because along with the bipolar issues, Mary Todd was a hoarder and a buyer. She just was spending outrageously. Now nowadays, presidents get paid fortunes. Back then, you got a little pipsqueak um, salary, and she was way outspending it. She was, and they were giving her credit because she was the first lady. So she was buying thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of things. Now, people who are bipolar or depressed, they will spend and do, because the spending is like a salve. And she was buying antique fabrics and beautiful silver and china and all sorts of stuff for for their life in the White House, but also for themselves. But he was practical. and so she was outspending what he was making. And he knew that when they got out, that he could be in the poorhouse. And so she was trying to hide it from him. But when he got, she had said, if he doesn't get reelected, we're sunk. And because with his salary, they could catch up what she had spent, but she had secret dirty bills. She had all these secret purchases, and it was coming to a mountain. And he didn't have to go through that, afterwards as much because toward, after the war, he was I think he won his second term, and then he was pretty much living with her, but they were having a lot of problems because, they were both depressed, and she was bipolar, and she was pitching fits, and that's part of bipolar. You get so frustrated, and there was no treatment. So, he had that going on. So he was kind of in a little bit of hell, but he loved her very much. He was always very good to her, and she loved him staunchly. And I mean, seriously, I mean, some of those congressmen are probably very lucky she didn't bonk them on the head. She would if she thought they were mistreating her husband. Woo! So, but he started to have premonitions of dying, and he had a dream that he heard crying, and he went down the hall, went to the stateroom, and there was a body laying in state. And there were all these people crying and sobbing, and he asked a mourner, said, "Who died?" And they said, "The assassinated president." And he went up to the casket, and he was inside it. And he knew it was coming. And she did too. She knew the night that they went to go to the theater. She had had a premonition, and she really thought that they shouldn't. She had a bad feeling, but he felt like they needed to. They needed to get out. And he was apparently enjoying the theater thing when he got shot by John Wilkes Booth. Now I know someone who's related to John Wilkes Booth. And so I think that would be an interesting thing to really look at. So, um, of course, the thing with John Wilkes Booth, he escaped, and later on they caught him, and they were supposed to take him alive, but they shot him where he was at. So, and there were conspirators. Some of the other ghosts of the White House, Mary Surratt, they convicted her as one of the hostess of the conspirators, kind of thing. And they really never were sure that she really was as guilty as they put her, but because it was such a mob mentality, um, they were going to hang her. Hung this whole group of people that they felt like were conspirators. That somebody had to be held responsible. And so her daughter. Now the White House wasn't as secure as it is now. Got that big fence, and you go over that fence or try to get on that gate, you're caught before you even get on the grass. Well, Mary Surratt's daughter Anna ran to the front door, beating on the front door, made her way into the White House begging for her mother's life, and it didn't work, and her mother was hung. And the ghost of Anna is just, they said for ages, could be heard banging on the front door or running through the hallways begging for her mother's life, for her release. That never came. And you would think some of the things with Lincoln would stop, but there was a lot of weird stuff that went on with Lincoln before he started haunting the White House. Because first, of course, you know, Mary was in outer space. She had just seen her husband's death. And just like Jackie Kennedy would say, she wasn't in the car. She was right next to him, but she was there for his death. And of course, she lost her mind. She lost her mind. She was laying in bed. She wouldn't go to the funeral. She couldn't. She couldn't get herself together. She laid there and had seances, had psychics coming to her bedside and trying to contact Abraham, and he was going to be buried in, I think it was Indiana. I think, I think. And so they were going to take his body on a train ride and take it all the way to where he was going to go be buried. And I could be wrong about any of it, but I think it's Indiana. Um, Look it up and tell me. You know, chalk it up to me being old and dropped on my head a few times. Um, but they put him on a train. Now, embalming was new. That was something they started really during that became huge during the Civil War. So they started embalming him. And they had an embalmer who went on the trip, and every stop they would they were showing his body, and they would change the clothes every few days. They would and shoot him full of embalming fluid and to make him presentable. And they had someone who was doing it. Something I did not know was that they had Willie's casket on the train as well to go with him. And that gets me chills, That gives me chills. But they had this train procession and it went for days and days, I think a couple of weeks. And you're talking about 1865, no air conditioning, no nothing. So they were keeping him on ice. I think they had a thing in the casket underneath. They would fill it with ice. They did have a way to make ice. And they would just kept him on ice and kept him on embalming fluid. And that was going pretty well. But Willie was on the train. So they were taking him to, I think it was called Oak Ridge, but it was a place, they had a place to put him temporarily as it, and there was these people raised money. They raised $50,000 in 1965's money to build a monument. Well, a place to bury him. Well, it wasn't where they didn't talk to Mary Todd. She didn't want to bury him there. She wanted to bury him at the Oak Ridge place. So that's where he wanted to be. So they had a place, put him in it, put Willie in there, and there were plans to build. I mean, and these people had built a monument place, quickly. And then she said, no, 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 we can't put him there. So they put him in this place that there was a crypt, a mausoleum, and a basement kind of thing to it. And so you would think, okay, well, he was there to rest, and Willie was with him. Well, someone in the 1870s decided and they were big counterfeiters, and their lead person had been caught and put in prison. So it cut off their money. So they had the big idea to steal Lincoln's body and hold it for $200,000 ransom in 1872's money, kind of. So they tried to steal the body. And one of their people was a kind of a spy. And so when they were getting the casket out, they sent this guy out to get the wagon, and when he went out, he had detectives waiting, and he signaled them, and they came and arrested all of them. Well, there was a group of people, the politicians and stuff, who decided, well, we have to protect the president's body if people are going to try and steal it. So they took the body and hid it in the basement, and they covered it with firewood, or wood that you wouldn't know. And no one knew that he wasn't in the mausoleum. He was hidden. And 6 years after he died, Tad died, his other son. And he just died out of panic, I think, because, you know, here's Mary Todd losing her mind. She lost her husband and two of her children, and she was afraid to lose him, and he died at 18. So, I mean, whoa. What can you say about that? And during the time that his body was being hidden, people kept looking at him. They wanted to make sure it was still him, the body hadn't been stolen. So over the years, people would look at his body. When Mary died, they hid her down there with him too, as far as I remember reading one time years ago. But when she finally died, her oldest son, Robert, in the 1875, had her institutionalized for a while. Now, going back, digressing, she was in the White House and they couldn't get her out after, they were needing to get her out to get the next president in. So finally, when she got herself together and left, now we're talking about a bipolar person here who had bought God knows how many thousands of dollars of China silver fabrics, dress materials, to make a dress. You had to have 10 to 12 yards. And she would get fantastic stuff, had all these trunks full of stuff. So they just wanted her to go away. So in the cover of night, she left. She went away, but she went away with about 100 and something, like 115 trunks full of stuff. And probably the White House China, who knows? And they were like, whatever, just go. So she went and lived with a relative for a long time, and one of the children who lived in the house said she spent her days just sitting in the attic, going through the trunks and looking at the things of her past, because all of her children, all of her family was dead, you know. And she said the attic floor was drooping because of all the trunks, all this stuff. And so it was pretty wild. So during this time, she had an elderly son, Robert, and he was trying there were plans to do a better place to bury their father. Robert knew about, the hiding of the bodies. And um they were going to build a new mausoleum kind of thing in 1901, 1900, I think. And so when they got that built, they moved, you know, Tad and Willie and Mary at that time. They moved, and Lincoln, they moved them into a mausoleum there and had big slabs on it and kept it protected. Well, people kept wanting to open the casket and make sure his body hadn't been stolen. So Robert was really weirded out by that. So when they did the newer mausoleum, he went in 1900, he went back in 1901, put in steel bars or some, caging over his parents' caskets and poured concrete over it, and so that they would leave his father alone. And you would think that would be the end of the story. Well, in the White House, of course, people would start to see, Lincoln in the Lincoln Room. Now, the Lincoln Room was used for the male dignitaries that would come. There was the Queen's Room, I think it was called the Rose Room, and that's where queens stayed. And one time, Queen Wilhelmina, who was the Queen of Netherlands, was staying there, and real late at night, knock, knock on the door. And she opened it, and there was Lincoln standing in the doorway. And she passed out cold, woke up laying on the floor. And the next day told them at, dinner, cocktails, saying, Lincoln scared me to death last night. And there was Truman, and there were other presidents who, um, let me think, who was the other one that I'm trying to think? I want to say FDR, but there were other presidents who would say, there were, you would hear the knocking on the door and you would open it. Nobody would be there, but you could feel this cold, moving cold spot. And as you'd feel it moving down the hallway and you'd hear footsteps going with it, and I thought, wow. There was Liz Coleman, I think is what her name was, who worked for like during the Johnson um oh situation era. She said that there was a secretary uh who was walking past the Lincoln Room one day and saw this very lanky tall guy putting on his boots sitting on the bed, and she screamed around because it was Lincoln. And there was a congressman, a valet, who ran out screaming and ran into a guard and said, I just saw Lincoln. And people would sometimes see him laying in the floor crying, or standing by the fireplace, and even during their time there, Mary, who was very psychic, would say, she heard Thomas Jefferson, who had been dead 20 years or so, playing the violin. She'd hear Andrew Jackson stomping and laughing, and actually in the Rose Room, there's a bed that was Andrew Jackson's, and people have heard him laughing from that bed. And I thought, now that's pretty special because they were going, he was such a crusty, cranky old guy. And here's this, you'd hear him laughing and stomping. He was real crude. So he's a crude, cranky, loud ghost. That there were other stories. Let me see. President Garfield, who was assassinated, James Garfield. I don't know that he was in the White House when it happened, but he was shot in the back and lived. But later on, they said if they had left the bullet alone, he might have been all right. But they took it out, and he got an infection and died from 10 days later from the bullet being removed. And they caught the guy that shot him, the assassin, and one of the guards, after Garfield was still, I think, laying in state in the White House, and one of the guards saw the assassin, who was supposed to be in jail on the premises, saw him running up the steps, and he chased him. Then when he got up to the top, and he kind of stopped, and he remembered, we executed him last week. So, they he was haunting for a while, and then there was a lawyer and a congressman who got in a fight. At some point, and there are bloody footprints on a marble stair where the lawyer got killed. The congressman killed him, and they said they couldn't get rid of the blood stains because the marble was very porous. So they and then there was another one where another congressman and a reporter got in an argument, and the congressman, they've conveniently lost his name over the years, um, cracked the guy's head and killed him because they just were in, heated argument. So he died. And so there's a lot of bloodshed in the White House. Mm. And like I said, Mary Todd was seeing ghosts. Um, l- and FDR, Truman, other people have seen, or talked about, or their secretaries have talked about seeing the ghosts there. And really, with Lincoln, of course, he would haunt. He had some of the worst things happen to him there. He lost his loved ones. He was in the midst of a war that threatened to tear this country apart. And, but it was a needed war. We needed to stop what was going on. And he pulled that trigger. And then he was killed, and at his funeral, of course, you had people who were mourning, the ex slaves and the people who really were for him, were weeping and they felt like they had lost their Moses. And then there were the haters who were so thrilled they just couldn't stand themselves. Um, so, Lincoln would be the one that would have the most reason to haunt. And they talk about him, there are so many people who do not want to stay. Well, Winston Churchill did not want to stay in the Lincoln Room after a couple of times because he apparently got scared of something, but he wouldn't say what. And Wilhelmina was the first one who just went, "Yeah, I saw him. He was standing in the doorway." And there's supposed to be there's a kind of a basement, I think. There's somewhere in one of the basements of one of the buildings. There's a kind of a mausoleum where other people are buried, and the on the property. And there's a ghost of this old colonel who if you're in there, apparently they say the door opens, kind of like by a mystical wind, and in walks this nicely dressed, very handsome colonel, who then just stomps through and walks out. You know, but there's enough that's happened there. There should be ghosts there in the War of 1812. When the soldiers came in and set fire and burned the White House, and there was some people who were staying in the ballet was having to get them out of there because they were very upset. And the guy said, "Well, he didn't know what to think." He said, "My wife thinks it's a ghost," and said that all night long this ghost kept coming in trying to set fire to the bed, and that's been told quite a bit. So I think that was very interesting. But so you never know what's going to cause a ghost or a haunting. And they also say there's in the catacombs under there's like a demon cat that when people see it, it means like a bad omen or whatever. I'd say, well, okie dokie. And oh, let me think. Now, some of the other stories. I mean, there's a lot more ghost stories in the White House. So if you look it up, if you want to look up the part about Lincoln and him being hidden, I just put in Lincoln's body hidden, and it'll bring up the story of they had to hide him. I thought, why don't they teach this in school? This stuff about, the people trying to hold his body for ransom. They had to hide him. People kept looking at him. They loved him so much they couldn't let him go. And I thought it goes back to like him not being able to let Willie go or Anne Rutledge. He kept going back and having to look at Willie. He couldn't let him go. So people started keep going back and they couldn't let Abraham go. He was so strong to them. And if you look at him, it's so sad, so pitiful. And he was taking medicine that had mercury in it. So his skin was starting to look kind of funky. That was probably because of the mercury. He was getting mercury poisoning. So if he hadn't been shot, and then too with Marfan's, when I was young, because I'm 62, when I was young, um, when I was in my 20s, they didn't think Marfan's people, their life expectancy was in the 40s, 50s. That's about it. Now we have a life expectancies in the 70s. So he was already 52 when he started being president. So, he probably would have not, he didn't look healthy. He had so much stress. And see, with Marfan's, you have aorta problems and things like that. And he had a wife that had mental issues and medical problems they had no treatments for. He had he had one child left that was small. He had Robert, but Robert, I think, didn't get along with Mary. So Robert was kind of separate. He was already an adult almost when they had their other babies. So he didn't have very much. He did have Tad and Mary, but Mary was so freaked out. She was freaking out. When is Tad gonna die? And then Tad died when he was 18, probably just from the fear. And since his father had probably had Marfan's, he probably had Marfan's. And I've known people that were 6 years old that died of Marfan's. I know people that were in their 50s, and then I know people who lived in their 70s, and you know, but he died afraid. So if anyone haunts the White House, they really had the makings of it. There was a reason for it. So now, I'm going to talk about some of the other ghost stories around that area and in Georgetown. Now, in Georgetown, uh, George Washington, Georgetown, um, he wanted to develop the areas and stuff, after, you know, he got going. So he hired people like Benjamin Stoddart to, they raised money to buy like 200 acres and develop Georgetown. And Benjamin Stoddart was very a good businessman, and he had been a colonel, I think. Been in the service and was trusted. And he did a really good job, and he helped in buying the land, developing stuff, and he bought a property, Georgetown Bluff, and he built a beautiful little house there. Well, after his service and after everything was over and he was finished with service, and I mean, he was rich because he had a shipping business, and the Georgetown Bluff, he had a very famous, planner come in and do this terraced garden. So you were on this hill with these beautiful gardens looking out over the Potomac River. So uh, or Potomac, excuse me, and he, in his later years, he wasn't so successful with the shipping business. It collapsed, and he became an invalid. And toward the end, he was an invalid and he was destitute, basically. And he would just sit in his house looking at life, watching people with a telescope, a spyglass, watching them. So, and he became very bitter. So after he died, now see, he had a beautiful little house. And so after he died, people would rent it and realized it was haunted. People would talk about seeing his ghost in the captain's chair, which is still, I think, up until the 70s, was still in the house. And I think it was called Halcyon House, built by Benjamin Stoddart. And he they would see his ghost, but you couldn't see his face. But there were paintings of him, and people would go, "Oh yeah, that's him." The ladies of the house would go, "Yeah, I've seen him sitting there." And they would also see a lady who would walk the halls, like taking care of stuff. And there, it was haunted, 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 haunted. Well, eventually, a man named Clemens bought it and built over it, made it bigger and weirder. He was kind of strange and made it weird. And I thought it looked like a beautiful building, but he built it over it, but it was real odd. Apparently, the way he did it, he just would hire his friends or whatever, and he and these people would just kind of build it, and they weren't really qualified to do all of it the way it should have been done. But then he had that. He apparently, this Mr. Clemens, thought of himself as a vampire. So he had a crypt built in some part of the house or in one of the outbuildings. He had a crypt and he would sleep in it because he thought he was a vampire. But you have to think about it at that time. Up until 1900, they were still thinking they were vampires. And when the TB epidemic happened, they thought that was caused by vampires, that the people were dying because they were being drained of blood or something. Consumption. They were being consumed by a vampire. So I have stories up until the 1900s where they would go and dig up graveyards and, dig up the graves of people. And if they were bloody or, because or they would say, well, that's the blood of their victims. Well, that happens sometimes with decomposition. So they would destroy, cut the heart out, burn the body, and do whatever, and do disturbing things. But up until 1900, 124 years ago, they were still doing that. So there were a lot of people who still thought they were vampires, and he thought he was a vampire. So when he finally died, he had instructions for them to take an instrument and to make sure he was dead, put it through his heart, a metal instrument. So he thought that would take care of him being a vampire. So then after that, the house kind of really got haunted. And during the Civil War, there was a tunnel built to the Potomac and River, for it was used as a underground railroad place station, to take people who were escaping from slavery, to save them and get them safe. So what would happen is, the slaves would have to, it was on, you'd have to swim through the river, get to the other side if you couldn't get a boat, but most of them weren't boats. You had to swim. A lot of people drowned trying to do it. They'd have to get to the tunnel, the hidden tunnel. Then they would have to get to the cellar. And most of them were starving. They were sick. They couldn't swim. So people drowned. People were exhausted. And if they made it to the tunnel, they were exhausted. They got into the cellar, which was damp. So a lot of people didn't make it to live. Some people did. So a lot of people survived, but a lot of people died in the cellar and before they got to the cellars. So in 1900, there was a story. There was a reported story of this man who they were talking to him, I think, in the 50s or 60s, but in 1900, he had been hired to come and close up this tunnel. He didn't know what it was for. But the owner said, well, we think the rats are coming through the tunnel and they're getting in the house. We're scared of that. So he came and he brought boards and plaster and all that stuff and he boarded up the hole. And as he was doing that, he kept hearing this. He thought it was the wind. It sounded like a moaning. So it made him work a little quicker. So he closed it up with wood and started plastering. And he was halfway through the plastering. And he started to hear moaning, really sobbing, moaning on the other side of the hole that he was plugging up and where he was, and he's like, ooh, I gotta get out of here, I gotta get out of here, gotta get this done quick. And he was doing it, getting quicker, getting nervous, doing it more. And then there was a scream, and he said, and at the moment he thought, maybe it came from upstairs. It was so close, but he didn't think about it coming from where he was at. He was trying not to be terrified. And he goes, well, then there's this sobbing that the only place you hear it is at a deathbed. And there was just, you'd hear sobbing and you hear more sobbing and you hear more and more moaning. And so he dropped his tools and ran and never went back to get his tools. And afterwards he asked, about the history and found out about the Underground Railroad, and it really bothered him. And he was saying, that was 50, 60 years ago, and this was in the 60s. And he said, I've never stopped worrying about those souls. And he said, I have dreams. I'll wake up and I'll be in a cold sweat, and I just can't quit thinking about them. And he said, I'll probably take that to my grave. And they said a few months later he died. So he did. He took it with him. And that house continued to be lived in. Continues, I guess, to still be lived in. But there were other people who were in it who had experiences. There was this woman ghost that people would say they couldn't really tell much about her, except that, she was wearing very old clothing that they didn't know what period it was from. But they had a grandchild who came and stayed for the summer, and the first few, you know, few nights, he would wake up screaming or whatever, and he said this a woman would wake him up, tucking him in. And then one day he came down to breakfast just happy as a little clam, and he said, "Guess what?" And they, what? And he says, "The ghost said she's not coming back." He said, "She woke me up last night and said, 'Don't worry, I won't be back.'" And she kissed him and disappeared out the window. And I thought, and nobody ever saw that ghost again. Now, it didn't stop the rapping and the scratching and the walking and the noise. And one of my favorite stories from it is in the 60s. Again, it's like 62, 63, around the time I was born. And there was a father and a son there. And the basement, the only way into it or out of it was the staircase from, the kitchen or whatever. There was no outer way to the cellar. And he was, uh, the son was going to go in the basement for something, and there was a light down there. And he said, "Who's down there?" And the light went out, and he freaked. He said he just got blood chilling cold, and he got his father to go get the police, and he stood there watching to make sure nobody came out. And the police got there, nobody there. So I thought, now that is scary. When you're in a room, I've had that happen with ghosts and hauntings where, you're in there and all of a sudden, click, they just did that. And for him to say who's there and it turn the light off, then it's conscious. It knows there's this person in there. It's usually can't see them, but they're in there. So that's nerve wracking. And it reminds me of a story. Erica, um, back in the 70s, she lived in this friend I knew years ago, a lady I knew, and she lived in this old house that her partner would work odd hours, so she was in the house by herself at night a lot, and she worked on the weekends. So during the weekdays, she was there by herself, and at 2 o'clock, she'd be sitting there, and you'd hear somebody walking up the gravel walkway coming up to the house, and they get to the door, ring the doorbell, and every light in the house would go off. And so she got to where she's going around the house with a baseball bat. And, and stuff like that. One time her and this girl named Kim were there. One of the roommates was sitting there with a big bowl of popcorn, going to watch a horror movie, like related Saturday or whatever it was. And this black tornado looking thing came out of the hallway, comes around, knocks the bowl of popcorn all over the place. And the boyfriend comes home in the morning, and they're both sitting on the porch waiting for him. Then that next weekend, they went out, and they had to come home. They caught a cab, and he brings them to their house, and he looks and goes, "Oh, that's Virginia's house." And he told her about it, which I knew about this story, but I didn't know that end of it. But in the 70s, there was a lady who lived in that house with her husband, and they were having it was a very violent household. So to get away from it, she would go out and go visit friends or whatever. And sometimes she'd walk up the street. She had friends at the firehouse. She would just get away from him. So one night she had come home by taxi and went to the door to get in, and the husband met her and blew her head off against the outside of shot her with a shotgun, blew her head off on the front of the house. And he said, "That's Virginia's house." And then he dropped them off, and they had to go in that house. So they were out of there as quick as possible. But see, the story from my end of it, my grandparents lived up this street from it, and it was built. It was this creepy old white house that lived on the hill, and so when I was little and we were taking care of my grandmother, it was probably 74 or 75, and I was little, and we were driving by, and you saw this blood all over the front of that house, and that's what had happened. He killed her, and someone said it had been on the news, but I didn't see it in the paper. Uh, but I remember that happening. And so that's where Virginia. And someone tore that house down and built a new one on it. And it's like, oh, no, 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 no. But Erica would say you'd hear those footsteps coming to the front door, ring the bell, every light in the house click. So, and I've been in places where that would happen. I've been in places where the light would go off, and then you would see this black figure standing in the corner, and you turn the light on, nothing there, but he was there listening and watching. So, puts creeps on you just a little. But now, let me think. Another part of the thing I was going to tell you, George Washington, who hired Benjamin Stoddard to build, to help develop or get the land to develop Georgetown. I have a connection. Excuse me. I have a connection to George Washington. And actually, I inherited these old pictures of George Washington and Martha that are really actually rare prints. And a friend of mine said, "Why have you got a picture of George Washington and Martha Washington on your walls?" And I went, I kind of forgot. And then it took me a while to remember. We had an ancestor named Garrett von Swearingen, or Van. They were Von and Van. So there was two members of the family. One was Von, one was Van. But I think Van is the one. Garrett Van Swearingen, I think, is the one. He was Dutch, and they were rich. And he was in running with against George Washington in one of his early campaigns. And then Garrett Swearingen, or Garrett von Swearingen, won. The only time that George Washington lost in a race was to Swearingen. And it's because he threw a bigger beer bash. So, and in those days, it was a different thing. You could get people to vote for you if you bought them a beer. So he threw a big party and he won. So the next time George Washington ran, he threw a bigger beer bash and he won. So, and he actually liked Swearingen. He thought that he was a hoot. Uh, but he he my relative was the only one who ever beat him. And uh, I'm doing my grandma's cookbook. So there's a story out right now with George Washington where in his cellar, the floor in the cellar had been bricked. They paved it in like 1770 or something like that. Well, they were excavating the floors not too long ago, and they found jars or bottles of cherries. And actually said one of them you could still smell cherry blossoms. And they thought at first it might be cherry bounce, which was one of George's favorite drinks. And they said they think it was just preserved cherries. But when I heard that, I went, cherry bounce. And I found so many recipes for cherry bounce. And because you would take the cherries and soak them in whiskey or brandy. Now, since they were fancy people, they would soak it in the best brandy. And you would put in, I think, a little cinnamon or whatever, a cinnamon stick. Put them in these bottles. Let them sit 3 weeks, whatever, or, the longer you let it sit, the better it gets. Then you get it, mash the cherries, take out the pits and all that, and boil it, whatever. Some people boil it and all that, but some people just soak the cherries in it and let it sit. And the longer it sat, the better it get. And it became like a cherry cordial. So it was a drink you could make at home. And but some people would make it with whiskey, and he would make it with brandy, and he loved it. And it was called Cherry Bounce. So I'm going to do that on my show when I start doing my TV show. So I thought, because I just thought it sounds so fascinating. But at that time you could make cherry bounce, you could make elderberry wine, you could make other cordials, made out of apricots and things like that, or what peach cordial, you know, as long as you have brandy or whiskey. And then when we had prohibition, they kind of put the kibosh on that. They're no fun. But our first president of the United States had the cherry bounce. But the bottles of cherries, because you didn't have refrigerators, sometimes you would bury the bottles, keep them in the ground to keep them cool. And then at some point they had lost track of those. I think they found more bottles. I would love for them to find a bottle of cherry bounce. But they said that it would get better the longer it sat. So if you let it sit for a year or so, it was fabulous. So I'm going to be making it and trying it. I'm not a drinker, but I will try that just because I'm fascinated. But that kind of led me to thinking about the White House and the ghosts. And Lincoln is the one that haunts it the most. He's the most famous ghost. And George Washington, I've heard a story about him before, but it was so long. But it was like, it was kind of like at the home he lived in, Mount, what was it, Mount Vernon? I think is what it's called. That they would see him pulling up in his horse. That's what he was doing when he got sick, got pneumonia. Um, but the White House is full of ghosts and ghost stories and mysteries and unseen things that we peons do not know about. But it is a great um, thing when we have ghost stories of that caliber, because in Europe, it's nothing for a house to be 1,000 years old. And they go, ghosts? Yeah. What ain't haunted? And you come here, and they go, "Your America's too young to have ghosts." Well, now we're old enough to have ghosts, and I'm very proud that we have some that have such a creep factor, I guess. But makes me want to go to the White House and go poke around. But there are people who will not stay in the Lincoln Room. They will not stay in the what is it? The East Room. They say Abigail Adams' ghost. When she lived there, the only big dry. It was still being kind of built, I think, under construction. And there was the East Room, and she would go to that and hang out her laundry and do her laundry. So they've seen her ghost walking around with her arms like she's carrying laundry going to the room. And my favorite White House ghost of all time is Dolly Madison. She did a beautiful garden of roses there. And one of the modern, I, I want to say it might have been Miss Lady Bird Johnson. It was one of in kind of in that era, and she thought it was too old fashioned, wanted to redo it. So she lined up gardeners to come and remove Dolly Madison's rose garden. And the gardeners showed up, and around the corner came this woman dressed from the 1800s, and it was Dolly Madison, and she was furious, and she tore them a new one, and they dropped trowel and ran. So for a while, the rose garden stay. I don't know that it's there anymore, but she wasn't having it. And actually, there's a house that she lived in after they left the White House that people see her when they would get out of the nightclubs and stuff. They would, for years and years and years, they get out of the bars, and there would be her ghost sitting on the porch, and people would go by and wave at her, you know. But I thought that was a hoot because they said those big burly men just scream and ran. I loved it. So now, we're coming to the close of our spooky White House uh, kind of stories, but maybe it will make you look at Lincoln a little differently. Maybe you could dig a little deeper and find out some of these stories. These stories were freaky. I mean, the fact that they buried him secretly had till 1900. So, you know, he was hid for a long time. Not lovely either. They had him hiding under scrap wood so no one would see him. And his casket weighed 500 pounds. It was wooden, but it was a lead casket inside of it. And right before they buried him, the people couldn't help it again. They cut open the lid, peeled it back, and 25 people looked in and said he looked the same. I mean, of course, he had his eyebrows had fallen off. That happens, but his hair was still there. His mustache, his beard, and his hair was there. His eyebrows were gone, but he was kind of covered in a powder. They thought it maybe was mortician's powder or makeup, from it had just powderized from 40 years, sitting in the lead casket. And his suit had all of this kind of strange mold growing on it, this yellow mold. He was put in a broadcloth suit that he'd worn like 2 weeks before he died. So, but they said it still looked like him. And that's quite a testament, to the embalmer's art, because now when they do people, you're only meant to last a few days, and then once people aren't looking at you, they don't care how long it lasts. But back then, that lasts. And if you want to see that kind of work, look, there is I want to say her name is Edith Cook. They found a little casket 3 or 4 years ago, I think, in California. The people were digging a pool, kind of sounds like poltergeist, and they found this iron casket, and it had a glass top in it. You had little panels over it, pulled them over, and it was a beautiful little girl. And so they people raised money, buried her, and they took DNA from her to be able to find out who she was, and they found out it was Edith Cook. Now, the people at the home said they were haunted. They could hear little feet of little. They had children, but they would hear a child running around at night, and it wasn't their children. And they thought it was her. They were very happy for her to be there. And what had happened is it had been an Oddfellows cemetery, and she had just been left, and she had died like when she was 3, and she was beautiful and perfect. The picture of her is beautiful, and still, you know, rosy cheeked looking, just beautiful little girl. And but she was in like an iron casket. Iron caskets and lead caskets really protected, but now but my uncle, when they were moving the cemeteries in Spring City in Tennessee for the TVA going to flood, make for the dam, he was watching them move a cemetery, and there was this guy, and this was in the 30s. So there was this guy that had been buried in the 1830s, and it had a little thing, and he pulled it aside, and you could see the man, and said he was perfect. And then when they were bringing him up, the casket wood cracked, air got to him, and he just disintegrated like a cigarette ash. So they always thought I find that fascinating. But it's the body's afterlife is one thing, and then the spirit afterlife is another. But what the body does is fascinating as well. But I hope that you enjoyed this haunted tour um, down the hallways and corridors of the haunted White House and Georgetown. And I will be back next week. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. But I hope that you had fun, and I hope it was informative and creepy at the same time. And we will see you again next week. Because of technical issues and difficulties, I'm pretty much doing them for Fridays, and then we get them posted, get them on YouTube, watch them on Facebook, and they'll be on YouTube and then on my channel. And until next week, my children of the dark, you know, be careful when you turn the lights out. You never know who's there. So, to all of you out there in the dark, good night. Good night.